this, and so, if you need to sit in the back to anchor the room so that it doesn't float away somehow, I understand that as well. So, no worries here one way or the other. All right, so today we're talking about what I would call social well-being. And if you remember absolutely nothing else from any of this that we talked about, the one thing to know is that friendships is the thing. It's it. It mitigates physical health issues, it mitigates spiritual health issues, it mitigates mental health issues. If we have friends, we have resilience. That's what all the research tells us. And I don't mean, this broad kind of social network junk that passes for friendships today. Quantity matters very little when it comes to social well-being. It's quality relationships. That's it. If you want to build your resilience for mental health, and sure, paid friends like me as a therapist or a coach can help you work on certain issues or help you build some tools or capacities to do good things. But the first thing that I tell anybody who's depressed that comes and is experiencing depression, go volunteer. Just go volunteer. It's all you need to do. I've lost more clients by telling them to go volunteer than I've kept. Because it takes us out of our interior world, takes us out of our self-reliance on just being us, or me, or an individual. And so, social well-being is really the linchpin to a lot of other health things that we face. We'll talk about that too. I was sitting here reading the AP news right before we started, and they were talking about the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops and their approach towards Joe Biden and abortion and communion. It's a touchy issue, I get it. And I'd only draw attention to it for the simple notion or understanding that communion is about connection. It's not about the elements to me. There are other theologies out there. It's about connection. It's about embodying a connection to God, embodying a connection to one another, embodying a connection to a community. I don't know where we went wrong in somehow thinking that what people believe excludes them from good relationships. But we've got to stop it, because it's just tearing us apart in many ways. And it's starting with communities of faith sometimes. We've got to stop. We've seen what the impact of rampant individualism is. It's a fractured society that adjudicates killing other people rather than understanding that any kind of killing is wrong. We look for self-defense, we look for premeditation, we look for whatever their internal world is, because it's about the individual now. It's not about the impact on the community and the systemic violence and racism that goes with that. We've privileged individualism. The last time I ever preached at one church, which happens a lot to me nowadays, I preached that Jesus Loves Me is the worst song that we ever teach children, because it's all about Jesus and me. It's not about Jesus and we, and Jesus and us. And if all we're teaching is that I matter and my individual salvation matters, then we're going to be in a lot more trouble down the road, because people are looking for connection. They're looking for places where they can come and question and be themselves and wonder and be different, but be accepted and belong. And it's really easy to form homogenous groups. It's really easy to like the people who are like us and not like the people who are not like us. I fall prey to this myself many times. As we talked about really early, it's the idiot driver complex. Everybody else is the worst driver in the world, but I'm awesome. And I'm working hard to get over that. It doesn't work all the time. My daughter can attest to that, especially 2 days ago, driving behind somebody who was being an idiot driver, at least to me. But idiot drivers cause us to do idiot things, like exclude and push people away. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit, I want to read 3 quotes to you here that are going to kind of ground what it is. I want to talk a little bit about social isolation and loneliness and what that actually does to us bodily, because I think it's important to know. And then I want to end, or at least end my part of the monologue here, talking about how do we make friends as adults. And then I want to hear from you. So I want you to start priming the pump with your own questions or your own thoughts or your own ideas. We'll talk about this today, and then next week we're going to kind of wrap all of what we've been talking about into this pandemic, endemic COVID space that we've been experiencing and that we will continue to experience to some kind of degree or extent. So we're going to kind of put all these together into a package and hand it to you to do something with. So let me read these 3 quotes here. This first one's from the Washington Post. And it reads that loneliness, long a bane of humanity, is increasingly seen as a serious public health hazard. Scientists who have identified significant links between loneliness and illness are pursuing the precise biological mechanisms that make it such a menace. Digging down to the molecular level and finding that social isolation changes the human genome in profound, long-lasting ways. Not only that, but the potential for damage caused by these genetic changes appears comparable to the injuries to health from smoking, diabetes, and obesity. The scientists' conclusion: loneliness can be a lethal risk. And the United States, which so prizes individuality, is doing far too little to alleviate it. And a second quote from a biological evolutionist: cooperation is the glue that binds individuals together and allows for the emergence of social structures or higher levels such as families, groups, organizations, nations, and civilizations. Our understanding of humankind is impossible in the absence of cooperation. And then finally, from Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up the other. But woe to the one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though one might prevail against another, 2 will withstand 1. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. It's amazing that a lot of our social science research basically just reinforces wisdom that's a couple thousand years old. Basically, what we've learned through all of our studies and all of our gatherings is that whoever wrote Ecclesiastes was right. We're better off together. We're better off when we cooperate. So some of the same research that looks at social isolation and loneliness says that, what we really need is 3 quality friendships in our life. 3. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. We need one that is at least a confidant. So 2 who lie together keep warm. If one falls, the other can pick them up. A confidant and 3 friends. That's what mitigates a lot of the physical and spiritual and mental health issues that we face in many ways. One of the researchers that looks at what they were talking about in the Washington Post quote, this idea that it changes the human genome, is that if we struggle with loneliness when we're younger, it's correlated with an increased risk of high blood pressure and heart disease when you get into your 30s. So our kids having connections, us having connections when we're younger, has longer term impacts on our health and our well-being. That baseline that we talked about some last week gets lowered a little bit. And so the capacity to fall into acute levels or chronic levels of stress become easier. And so when we're thinking about things like social isolation, and a lot of the research that's been done in this space has been done with adolescents and done with older folks. So let's talk a little bit about what each one of them is, because social isolation and loneliness are a little bit different. And I do want to say, I'm an introvert. 4 days out of 7, I really don't like people and like talking to people. Sometimes I like them enough to reach out or do certain things. But it doesn't matter if you're introverted or extroverted. Quality relationships matter. I know my 3 people that I can talk to if I'm struggling with something. And I know that, and for the most part, trust that they will be empathic and compassionate, but also challenging, and help me move out of the space that I have comforted myself into. And just because we comfort ourselves into a space doesn't mean it's a healthy space. We can comfort ourselves into angry spaces and depressed spaces and anxious spaces because we feel like that's where our security lies. But anxiety and depression particularly are diseases of individuality. They are diseases that cause an internal avalanche in our brains that decrease our likelihood of reaching out for help. They're those internal echo chambers that I'm not worthy of connection. And when I reached out, they didn't call me back immediately, and therefore that shows that I'm not worthy of connection. And so we spiral down into spaces, or I reached out for help and the help didn't come in the way that I wanted it to, and so I'm anxious about reaching out for help again because I don't know what's going to happen, so I just won't reach out for help. Most generalized anxiety, most non-clinical neuropsychological depression is a disease of individuality. And community, trusting community, community where there's a confidant, community where there's regular contact, mitigates a whole mess of stuff. So social isolation is what we think of when we think of the objective thing. It's when I don't feel like I belong. It's when I have less engagement with other people, so we can kind of measure it. I used to have this engagement, but I don't have this engagement now. We have a minimal number of social contacts, so that less than 3 that we could call for coffee or a beer or pickleball or whatever it is that we do. And then the network that we have, it's all Instagram, it's all Facebook, it's all Twitter. We consider that our social network. So really, it's minimal to nothing at the end of the day. So what we know about social isolation is that it leads to increased mortality, increased dementia, an increase in rehospitalization if we have an initial hospitalization, an increase in inflammatory diseases. It makes our joints hurt to be alone. An increase in suicidal thought, a decrease in self-esteem, an increase in the internalization of negative thoughts, so depression and anxiety, an increase in stress, anxiety, and anger, a decrease in optimism, and of course, an increase in mental health issues. When we are alone, we hurt ourselves, whether we physically do anything to ourselves or not. Like we talked about, the health impact is similar to diabetes, smoking, or obesity. Being alone accelerates our aging. Being alone makes us feel older than we should or could feel. And then it elevates blood pressure and puts us at a more severe risk for heart disease or other heart issues. So loneliness, on the other hand, is the what I feel. So if social isolation is something that we can measure by how we're connected to the people around us or the things around us, loneliness is subjective. So you can be in a room full of people and feel lonely, but not look socially isolated, if that makes sense. We can be in this room together, but we can also feel lonely in this room. And so loneliness is kind of an unwelcome or unwanted negative experience associated with how we perceive our social relationships and engagement. It's how I feel about being in the space. It's how I feel about whether I'm connected or not. And what research kind of tells us right now, it's interesting always looking at research like this, that 10 to 60% of people experience loneliness. It's a pretty broad range. But in that narrowing down, roughly about 7 to 10% experience severe loneliness. That is, I'm unworthy to connect, and nobody will connect with me, and I don't belong anywhere. And so, I don't know what church is about for you. But if it's not about helping people find a place to belong, to connect with God and connect with one another, that whole love God, love neighbor, love self thing that we're supposed to be doing, we think's really hard, but it probably shouldn't be. Love is about belonging. It's patient, it's kind, it's accepting. I can't think of anybody else to be more patient and kind with than someone who is different than me, or someone who needs time to explain themselves or talk about what's meaningful to them. There was a study done a while ago with doctors in the emergency room about connection with patients. And they said, on average, it takes 11 seconds for a doctor to diagnose what's going on with a patient and start telling them treatment plans. It takes 17 seconds for a patient to explain what they're experiencing and feel connected to the doctor. 6 seconds is what it takes, that 6-second difference to connect. And what we found with patients who connect with their doctors is that they're more likely to follow the instructions. They're more likely to follow through with treatment plans. So a 6-second difference in the emergency room for potentially better outcomes. I know I have a habit at times of hearing the story and jumping to the conclusions and figuring out where they're going and what they're going to say. It's, almost 20 years of being a therapist. 20 plus years coaching of kind of, okay, I've heard something similar enough, therefore I have some clues and I'm going to take those clues and jump to a conclusion rather than let's just sit patient. So I have to constantly remind myself to say, you know what, let's be a little less smart here and a little more stupid so that I can remember that each person that I come in contact with is different. Each story may have some similar clues to it, but they may have a different outcome, a different emotional set, a different set of connections that they're trying to work through. So being a little more stupid is my goal most days. Along with that is being a little more curious. What got you there? What does that mean? How do you deal with that? I can't imagine what that's like. Tell me. Learning simple words, simple phrases, simple questions. And we struggle with that. You know, our churches are wonderful and beautiful places to connect. They're often pretty safe places to connect. And I mean that in both the positive and negative way. There's nothing risky about connecting in a homogeneous group. There's nothing risky about feeling comfort and not pushing ourselves any further. And that's one of the most interesting things about social isolation and loneliness and about making friends as adults. I mean, I'll attest, I don't know how it is for you, but I don't make friends easily. It's just harder with adults, and a lot of my friends actually are parents of my kids' friends. It's kind of just how it happened along the way. And so making friends individual of that, learning how to do it myself has been a challenge at times. You know, you add introversion to that and it's just, you know, is this going to be a waste of energy? Am I going to be sleeping for 3 days after talking to you in depth and meaningfully? Whatever it is. Part of what it means to not socially isolate, to not be lonely, is to learn how to make friends. And so I scoured the internet and all, you know, the great wisdom from Oprah to Psychology Today to random blogs of anybody who'll write anything about friendships and adults, to distill down a couple ideas. Your mileage may vary. Take what is the lowest hanging fruit for you, and take it as an opportunity to do something rather than just think something. So making friends as adults, you know, I mean, the first and most obvious is meet new people. seems simple to some extent and also seems really hard. But we've got to learn to mix it up a little bit. We all fall into routines. We fall into shortcuts that get us through our day. Mitigate stress, mitigate other kind of negative emotions or experiences. We have to break ourselves out of the routines of our day and mix it up a tiny bit. That's been harder over the last 18 months. And 18 months is long enough to reify, to solidify certain habits. We all most likely have a pandemic routine. I take a lot more showers in the evening than I did in the morning when I had to go out every day and go into an office or go into a workplace. So new habits, we need to mix up our routines a little bit, break ourselves out of particular things that we've been doing. Keep an open mind. This is number 2. As we age, learning and experiencing new things is vital to overall health. This is part of some of the dementia and Alzheimer's research, is that folks who are constantly learning new things, trying new things, risking new things, have a greater correlated advantage to holding off dementia and Alzheimer's. When we are using our brains and making those new connections, remember we talked about this very early on, our brains are wonderful connection-making machines, and we are constantly connecting new neurons to one another and building new pathways. Remember our pink elephant riding the scooter down Montview, creating those new pathways, those new spaces. And so, having people who think just like us is comforting, but it limits learning opportunities. If you're talking to someone and all they say is, "Oh, I agree," what are you learning? You're learning that you're eloquent enough at explaining what it is, or you're ineloquent enough that they're just going to say, "I agree," so you'll shut up. We need people who challenge us. We need learning opportunities that challenge us so that we're constantly making those mental, neurological connections over time. Number 3, you aren't alone. Everyone is trying to find a friend, and nobody is good at it. There's not some friendship hierarchy scale that you're put upon that rates your skills at doing it. Everybody's kind of down near the bottom if there is. So everybody's learning how to do this. Everybody is trying to find a connection. If we think about that idea of cooperation, we have a biological drive to be together that has been conserved throughout our history over time, which requires our cooperation, which in turn requires communication, requires learning, requires making new connections, requires trust. And trust means that we have to relate and we have to know each other. So all of these things matter, and we've just become less good at it over time. All right, number 4. One way to do this is to deepen casual connections. So be curious about acquaintances. Be curious about people with similar interests. Look for common denominators rather than look for differentiators. So my dad and I are probably two of the more opposite people when it comes to politics. He resides on one end of a spectrum and I reside on the other. And we don't talk about it. Haven't talked about it probably in 10 years, not deeply, because there is such a deep divide there when it comes to how we see the world and how we interact in the world and how we understand what's important in the world, or at least so I thought. So we were driving 3 or 4 years ago in his truck in northwest Georgia. So if you know anything about politics, you know who the representative of northwest Georgia is. And we were talking about how do you make the world a better place? And come to find out that we both thought human connection and community was where change happened. Never knew that about him. Never knew that's how. We just had different modes of wanting to uphold that. Different ideas about where change happens. He saw it more at a local, grassroots, highly contextual level, which is what I would say. I don't know that he would use those words, but I would. That local communities are really where change happens and where community is built and I saw it as more of a big thing. That it's a whole culture thing and that we need big ethics and big ideas and big moralities that seep into our brains and seep into the fabric of how we are. And that's what changes and builds community in the long run. And it's different methods of getting to the same thing, which is people who are more caring and loving to the people around them. Never knew that. Never would have known that if I hadn't just shut up and looked for the common denominator rather than look for the difference. It's so easy to find difference, especially nowadays. So easy to look online and someone posts something that we don't agree with and go, unfriend. So easy with social networking algorithms to only hear what makes us feel comfortable. And what we're finding in the news is that's what they built it for. Online networking is built for your psychological comfort and increased engagement, nothing else. Because increased engagement drives dollars. It drives advertisement. And when you feel connected to something, you're going to use it more often. You're going to be there more often. So it creates an addictive cycle where when we don't feel connected in the 3D world, we can go to the 2D world and feel like people get us. But getting us is not about agreeing with us. Getting us is about being with us in spaces that are easy and difficult. Being able to hear when we have questions, when we have thoughts. And be curious rather than look for what's wrong with what we're saying. And this is what's been interesting about our culture, and it's been written about probably since the 60s. Ours is a culture of debate, not a culture of dialogue. It's a culture of winning and losing, not a culture of cooperation and collaboration and mutual benefit and building up. We teach our children to pick apart arguments. We've learned to pick apart arguments and help people understand the fallacy of their logic, rather than getting to the curiosity of how did you even come to that opinion in the first place? I taught all the pastors when I taught at ILF 2 things. Just go into this world and be curious and stupid. It's all you need to do to be a good pastor. Be curious and stupid about the scripture. You don't have to know what it says, but be curious about what it means. Be curious about how it applies to folks. If you're going for a pastoral care visit, don't assume you know everything, even if the story feels familiar. If you're teaching a class, be curious and stupid. Sure, know some things, but I don't know your experience. I want to. I wish we had the space to be able to do that a little differently. All right, so number 5, build for quality, not quantity. So again, when we talk about social networks and we talk about mitigating isolation and loneliness, we're talking about quality relationships. The number of social networking imprints that you have do not mitigate social isolation and loneliness. That's not to say that they can't help. That's not to say that they haven't made the world more accessible for people who can't be in the spaces that we can be in sometimes. But generally speaking, what we find is that being connected to folks is different from posting a meme, posting a New York Times article, posting what we think is a provocative question, posting a scripture verse. That's not social connection. It's not even social networking. It's arrogant. It's primping. It's posturing. So look for quality connections. And along that lines, don't be afraid to say no. This is not a deep social connection for me. It's okay to prune the trees. That's what keeps them healthy. It's okay to start down a road with somebody and say, you know what, this is just going to kind of stay as an acquaintance, and that's okay. Because you're going to put more time, more stress, more effort into trying to make something happen rather than be present to something happening. All right, last one. This goes back to the very first one of meeting new people. Also goes back to the idea of lifelong learning. Join a group. A group, a church, a community. Take a class. If you're a sports person, play a sport. There are things that we can do. Join a book club if you like to read. Take a cooking class if you can, even if you're taking one online. Look for the people who think similarly, not the same, but similarly to you. Because everybody in that class has a common denominator with you. You share an interest immediately. We talk about this as therapists all the time, and the fancy word of building rapport. And there's 2 theories of building rapport. The first theory is that it just takes a ton of time. You have to build the relationship and build the trust over time and build all of these things over time. And, for long-term therapists, it's 6 to 12 weeks before you even intervene because you're just working on the relationship and building trust and building rapport. The other theory is that people gather because they have a common interest. The therapist has a common interest of wanting someone to heal from something that hurts them. And the person coming has a common interest of wanting to heal from something that hurts them. So rapport is already there because you have a common denominator. You just have to figure out what the common denominator is and move forward from there. Personally, I'm a hybrid kind of person. I think we should be moving, but I also think that trust and relationship takes some time. And it takes some effort, mainly because we're not good at them. Jesus did not go and minister by himself. His first acts of ministry was building a community, was building quality relationships of people who were similar but different than he. Carpenters rarely go looking for fishermen to learn how to continue building what they're building. They look for the diversity, they look for the difference, and find ways to include it. We have this habit of nowadays thinking of diversity, equity, and inclusion as anything non-white, basically. Diversity, equity, and inclusion has to do with mental health, serious mental illness. It has to do with physical disability. It has to do with chronic illness and ailment. It has to do with political ideologies and tensions. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, when it only refers to certain groups, is exclusionary. If it only refers to certain ideologies, it's exclusionary. And I'm here to tell you, the work stinks. Nobody stays in a DEI position for long. Because it's hard. And it's easy after 18 plus months of pandemic living to just want to feel safe. To just want to be secure. To just want to do whatever it is we did beforehand that we are so aggrieved that we lost. That we feel that life would suddenly be better if we could just do that one thing. Go sit in a coffee shop and wave to people without a mask and greet folks. To give a hug without worrying about whether they're sniffling or not. And this is part of what we'll talk about some next week, that we are living through a time of collective grief and trauma. Period. And grief is a process that, frankly, we're terrible at. We've all lost people, lost freedoms, lost security blankets, lost relationships. And when we don't grieve or have an effective way of grieving that, we are stunted in our growth. And so as we have experienced collective grief and trauma, what's going to get us out of it is collectively grieving and collectively working towards post-traumatic growth. You will not do it yourself. I'm sorry. I wish there was a great Colorado bootstrap story that we could just all put them on and kick grief's ass. But there's not. We have to do it together. if we want to come out of this healthy, if we want to come out of this finding the opportunities to grow. And that doesn't mean that we haven't suffered. It doesn't mean that we ignore that. It means that every person in this room has a common denominator of grief, a common denominator of pandemic routines, a common denominator of loss. If we would take a moment and connect with each other about those and connect with how is it that we have survived this stuff. It's amazing that we might find some friends. And in finding some friends, mitigate further impact of the pandemic. And reestablish some self-confidence and some self-esteem to step out of this space and go join a class where there may be diverse common denominators there, and there may be a really interesting person, or there may not be, and we have to take a different class, or join a book study, or play pickleball, or basketball, or tennis, or racquetball, or join a Bible study, or find an online community, or whatever it may be. We are going to have to learn how to take steps again. We have been through a time of prolonged illness, basically. And so, as we emerge, we have to go to physical, mental, spiritual, social therapy to begin to walk again, to begin to crawl again, to begin just any movement. You don't know what a smile means to some people. What an acknowledgement, a hello, a how are you not in passing, but a how are you in stopping means. And we'll never know unless we try. For some people it will mean nothing, and for some people it will mean everything. Because they don't have the 3 chords that aren't quickly broken. They don't have someone else to keep warm. All right. Let's see what our time is here. Got 8 to 10 minutes here. Thoughts, questions, ideas, worries, experiences, whatever.
Kate? Yep, it's on. Yep.
Thank
Matt,
you.
I'm going to have you stand up so we can, and use a microphone so that the people at home can hear.
How do we make friends with people that are not like us?
I think, so there's a quote that I often go back to when I think about just the great world of writing that I live in that's kind of inside my head, but a little bit more than that, and came from 2 psychologists in the 50s that said that at the exact same time, every person is like all other people, like some other people, and like no other person. Everybody is different. Our experience makes sure of that. Everybody has some similarities. We may experience the same thing and have a different reaction to it. So how can we be curious about how someone else reacted to it? We think about traumatic situations, really only about 15% 20% of people in extreme traumatic situations form a post-traumatic stress response. The other 85% don't. So this is where we get curious. One of the things I loved about training as a coach that's much different than training as a therapist is that it's not about me. It's about being curious about what the person's bringing with them to help them use that in the healthiest way possible. Because if I'm concerned about me and what I think and how do I get my points across, it's really hard to open ourselves to other people and what they bring. And some of the stuff they bring is angering. I used to tell my students that you can believe anything you want to believe. Doesn't matter. I'm not going to be offended by it. As long as it is healthy for you and healthy for the people around you. When one of those two bounds are crossed, we're going to have some serious conversation about how these beliefs are informing your action in the world. Health and well-being for me. And so I'm happy to have debates and dialogue with people of difference. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying I don't get hot, angry sometimes. And I just do my best to hopefully keep learning how to be curious. Keep learning how to say, gosh, I don't understand how you came to that conclusion because that's not anywhere near where I would be. Yeah, I think that's what I got right now. Thank you. Others?
Good morning. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You had two examples through your discussion with, I think, your kids and your father.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering how you think about reconnecting with family and where that fits into your framework of isolation and connection.
Yeah. Reconnecting with family is really hard. It was for me, at least. I'll talk just personally. Still is hard. Just because we had one good conversation in a truck in the North Georgia mountains doesn't mean everything is kosher or easy or loving. I think at times we have to make decisions about where to put our energy. I think there's two kinds of family in this world. It's the family that we're born into. There's the family that we choose to live with. We have family of choice because the rest of our family lives on the East Coast. So we need to have family of choice, supported people in this space. It's funny, family systems theory talks about when you go home, it takes approximately 48 hours for you to revert to a teenager if you're going home to visit your parents. So whatever you used to do when you were a teenager, slam doors, shut people down, whenever you got angry, whatever, that's pretty much what we continue to do. And it's just those neural pathways that got ingrained really deeply into our brains. And it takes a long time to unwind that and a lot of help to unwind that. I know Thanksgiving's coming up. I know Christmas is coming up. If you don't know that, then the media will be certain to tell you both that it's coming, but also that it's going to be fraught with perils of family visits. There'll be the plethora of articles about how to go talk to your parents or talk to your siblings or talk to whoever. What I would say is, in part, put the appropriate amount of energy. That is, if someone is not putting the same amount of energy into connecting that you are, then understand what the limits of that relationship are and be honest about them. My dad is never going to, I'm not going to change his ideology, his political ideas, his emails, his memes, his disparaging stuff that he sends from time to time. I'm not going to change that. Doesn't mean I don't love him. Doesn't mean I don't care about him. Doesn't mean I don't honor his experience and the experiences that got him to that space. It just means that there are other relationships that will be sustaining for a lot longer that I want to direct my energy toward. And I will direct the appropriate amount of energy to that relationship. To do that, to honor the stories, to honor the experiences, to honor the values as best I can, even if they're different from me. He will never understand, I don't think, that who I am is because of who he is and what he and my mom taught me about compassion and kindness and love. I just have a different way of expressing that in the world and a different way of kind of trying to put that forward as something meaningful. And so it's a grieving. There's grief with that. There's sadness with that. There's hurt with that. Who knows? The next time you have a conversation with them, something may change, and get curious about it. I'm always curious about the openings because it's easy to see the doors that are shut. Why is this open a crack right now? You know, my dad was a banker, amazing man, one company all his life, from a penny roller to a C-suite executive throughout his career. But that's the milieu that he grew up in. And so when he sends me stuff about the economy, sends me stuff about inflation, which he's been sending me for a year now, because he has that mind that works forward. I see it as not a political thing, but as wanting our family to be taken care of. Wanting us to be prepared for ups and downs. Because a lot of it has political stuff that comes with it. So I look for the openings. It's easy to see the closings. It's easy to see where it stops. It's easy to see difference. And I don't mean difference in a diversity way, difference in a you're wrong way. It is so easy to find that. I know, but we're gonna, yep.
Thank you so much. And
Thanks, folks.
I would encourage those of you who might have more questions on this aspect of social well-being to bring them next week. Next week, Jason wraps up the whole wonderful series on reimagining well-being. Thank you, Jason, and
Thanks,
thank
folks.
you all for attending.